Okay. Hello, everyone. Um, just want to begin by acknowledging that I'm calling in from the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation as Richard and Ardor. Also want to acknowledge that Professor Melinda Cooper is joining us from the unceded lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and that Professor James Martell is joining us from the unceded land of the Ramaytush band of the Online people. So we pay our respects to the elders of those people, and we also acknowledge the responsibilities that um, uh, the histories of colonization on these lands places upon us. So welcome everyone to this event on Silicon Valley and the End Times, the law, politics, and economy of apocalypse. My name is Andre Dow. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow with the Laureate Program in Global Corporations and International Law at Melbourne Law School, directed by Professor Sandhya Pahuja, and I'm stepping in for her today as chair. And today we have a really incredible star-studded lineup to hopefully, or I'm sure we will be learning more about what is sometimes incoherent, sometimes frankly weird world of Silicon Valley and apocalyptic thinking. So this event is a co-badged event that's hosted by the Institute of International Law and Humanities, the Laureate Program of Global Corporations International Law, and the Australian Research Council Discovery Project on Humanism and International Law. So without too much further ado, I'm going to introduce our speakers who will speak for about 10 minutes each. I might just introduce each speaker as they step up to the proverbial lectern rather than read a long list of achievements. So we first are going to hear from Professor Melinda Cooper, who's a professor in the School of Sociology at the Australian National University. Her research focuses on the interaction between neoliberal and new conservative philosophies of power. Her publications include Counter-Revolution, Extravagance and Austerity in Public Finance, Family Values Between Neoliberalism and the New Social Conservatism. And today, Professor Cooper is going to speak to us on reactionary futurism. So over to you, Melinda.
Yeah. Okay, so my paper is a little bit tangential to the others, which is why I'm going first. Lately, I've been looking at the work of Joseph Schumpeter, the Austrian economist, and I've been thinking about his analysis of the temporality of capitalism, because I think it resonates in some quite interesting ways with contemporary debates about the feudal or neo-feudal character of the high-tech economy. And I've been interested in the ways in which the structure of the American corporation has changed over the last few decades, and how these changes run counter to the expected development of American capitalism. So the generally accepted idea for a long time was that the timeline of American capital since the first decades of the 20th century, at least, was moving toward mass ownership of shares and a growing separation between the functions of the manager and the owner. The baseline here was the privately owned, the closely held, often family-controlled corporation, which was still surprisingly widespread at the turn of the century. And the idea was that as America's most dynamic corporations grew larger, they were inevitably going to move away from this structure, because a company that needed large volumes of capital needed to float its shares and opt for wide public ownership. So the popular narrative around this transition assumes a kind of progressive developmental momentum towards a form of corporate structure that is more democratic, more modern, more dynamic, but also more professionalized. And naturally, America is presumed to be leading the way. You'll find this idea reflected in the work of historians like Alfred Chandler, who sees Western European capitalism as more backward and somehow archaic because it remained for so long dominated by dynastic enterprises and the like. But there's also a counter tradition of thinkers who were much more circumspect about this development. And they saw the shift from the privately held to the publicly traded corporation as a real loss, actually as running counter to the true spirit of capitalism, or what they saw as the true spirit of capitalism. So the Austrian economist Joseph Schumpeter is one of these romantic reactionary thinkers. And I find that very interesting because throughout the dot-com boom of the 1990s, Schumpeter was lionized. He was held up as a kind of patron saint of the new tech economy, but also by default, I think, as a champion of shareholder democracy, because these things were thought to go together. And without really reading or taking Schumpeter seriously as a political thinker, economists who were inspired by Schumpeter edited out this kind of romantic reactionary current in his thinking. But it's by no means marginal. It's there in his serious major later works as much as in his earlier works. The New Democrats under Clinton certainly embraced various updated versions of Schumpeterian economics as a way of arguing that supply-side investment in R&D could replace demand-side Keynesianism as a new engine of growth and prosperity. But to anchor this back to our topic, Schumpeter very much did have a pessimistic eschatological view on the future of capitalism. And it's a vision that was developed in an interesting kind of dialogue with Marx. What he admires in Marx's work is Marx's willingness to move fast and break things, if you like. He's fascinated by Marx and Engels' claim in the Communist Manifesto that bourgeois capitalism is itself this protean revolutionary force that just needs to be pushed a little bit further. And this is the kind of catastrophist, revolutionary vision of the capitalist economy that he wants to reclaim from the tedium of neoclassical economics, with its endless returns to equilibrium and its stationary states. Of course, it takes a lot of work to reclaim revolution for capitalism, but it's an argument that Schumpeter makes by redefining socialism as this very stolid, bureaucratic, and equalizing project, in contrast to the spirit of enterprise, which is all about generating radical novelty in the world through acts of creative destruction. To cut a very long argument short, Schumpeter is defining mass democracy as equalizing and hence hostile to innovation. And he sees the rise of the publicly traded, mass shareholder-owned corporation as suffering from the same democratic defects, as a symptom of this. So there's that very interesting, famous passage in the third volume of Capital, where Marx talks about the development of the joint stock company as an incipient socialization of capital, a partial abolition of private ownership from within the confines of capitalism. And Schumpeter basically runs with this and says, look how far we've fallen. Look how far the corporation has been democratized and socialized. And how can we expect to see any creative destruction in the world, any innovation, when this is the case? So the privately held, family-oriented corporation is very much Schumpeter's ideal. And although he realizes it's on the wane, he thinks that large industrial corporations are able to achieve innovation only insofar as they are able to insulate some of their managerial functions from the interference of public shareholders. There's a passage in Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy where he writes that the most glamorous of bourgeois aims is the foundation of an industrial dynasty. And he laments the fact that it's becoming harder and harder to achieve this. It's a vision that runs directly counter to the modernizing view of capitalism. So you find Schumpeter indulging in all kinds of bizarre medievalist fantasies about the entrepreneur or the founder as a kind of feudal lord commanding complete loyalty from his underlings. But it's not a straightforwardly conservative view either, because Schumpeter is interested in the ability of heroic entrepreneurs to create new enterprises and found new dynasties. Okay, so it's not a kind of romanticization of the inheritance of old dynastic enterprises, but the creation of new dynasties. It's what I would call a kind of reactionary futurism or revolutionary conservatism. So to return to the question of eschatology, Schumpeter indulges in this vision of a true entrepreneurial economy of founders and private dynastic companies, but is completely pessimistic about its prospects. His overwhelming sense is that the spirit of enterprise is fated to succumb to the modernizing, equalizing forces of mass democracy, if not socialism. And the publicly traded managerial corporation is the symptom of that. And I think until quite recently, most business historians and organization theorists would have agreed with him, minus the melodrama, that this was the trajectory of capitalism, certainly American capitalism. What's so remarkable about the recent history of the high-tech economy is the fact that it has played Schumpeter's eschatological timeline in reverse, reinventing forms of corporate control that replicate the hierarchical, executive, patrimonial, quasi-feudal powers of the founder as Schumpeter imagined it. I think the fact that people reach so intuitively for the feudal metaphor speaks to the fact that we almost unquestionably adhere to a liberal narrative about the timeline of capitalism that can only understand overtly anti-democratic expressions of power as a reversion to the pre-modern and perhaps the pre-capitalist. I think that's a historiographical mistake and a mistake that Marx himself made at times. But I also think that the mistake itself is good to think with, if you like. And I certainly find it interesting that so many people, from Marxists to tech bros themselves to Schumpeter, feel compelled to look to the feudal to make sense of a form of capitalism that is overtly anti-democratic and reactionary in spirit. I've become very interested in the historiography of history, if you like, in particular, the critical historiography of the concept of the feudal and the conceptual work it plays in accounting for apparent regressions or anachronisms in accounts of Western capitalism. I think insofar as today's tech billionaires have a shared sense of their mission, and they do to a remarkable extent, it can be defined as a kind of revolutionary conservatism, but one that is much more optimistic and triumphalist than Schumpeter's. In a lot of ways, it seems that these people have been able to remake the organizational and legal structure of the corporation to approximate Schumpeter's ideal of the closely held, founder-controlled, and family-oriented enterprise. So they've realized the ideal that Schumpeter projected into the distant past and the far future. By the way, and to conclude, I think, and I've been arguing recently, that the term revolutionary conservatism is a good umbrella term for various kinds of far-right politics, including but not limited to fascism. But that's another story, I think, and I'll leave it to the next speakers to continue the conversation.
Thank you so much, Melinda, for that brilliant opening. And I do recommend, highly recommend to anyone who hasn't read it, that Melinda's chapter in a forthcoming book called Rebooting Political Economy, her chapter of patrimonial capitalism, agency theory, and the return of dynastic wealth is well worth reading for more on this particular shift around founder controlled corporations. So thank you so much, Linda. I neglected to say at the beginning that if that we'll have hopefully a little bit of time at the end for Q&A, and so do pop any questions you have into the Q&A function on Zoom, and that's going to be monitored by myself, but also by Claire Rule, who I neglected to thank profusely at the beginning for all of the work that she's done to make today possible. So thank you, Claire. We now are going to hear from Dr. Richard Joyce. Richard is a senior lecturer here at the Melbourne Law School, and his research focuses on the history and theory of international law, with particular interest in the theory and political theology of sovereignty. He's the author of Competing Sovereignties and is currently working on a book project entitled Populist Imperialism as part of his ARC Discovery project. And Richard will be telling us about bad eschatology making nonsense of the lands. Over to you, Richard.
Thanks very much, Andre, and thanks everyone for coming, and to my co-panelists who I've learned so much from in thinking about these issues. Okay. So in San Francisco last September, and then again in Rome in March this year, Peter Thiel gave a series of closed-door lectures on the topic of the Antichrist, details of which have subsequently leaked out. Some of you will also be aware of an interview he gave with the Catholic conservative New York Times columnist Ross Douthat. Beyond these specific interventions are a number of texts published online which engage with apocalyptic themes more generally, especially in their relationship to technology. And we also have Thiel's personal fears of the apocalypse manifesting in his survivalist compound in New Zealand. Now, despite Ross Douthat suggesting that there is, he says, a good case that Thiel is the most influential right-wing intellectual of the last 20 years, I think it's pretty clear that Thiel's apocalyptic interventions are not the product of rigorous intellectual activity. They are incoherent, speculative, contradictory, and often tedious and boring. The main constituency of people willing to pay to hear them are, of course, tech entrepreneurs hoping to get close to Thiel personally and also to attract some capital for their startups. That said, certain recurring ideas emerge, and in the slides you'll see some quotes that I have put up there. I won't read out, but they'll give you some sense of Thiel's thinking around these ideas, but I'll try to organize those a little bit for you. Okay, so for Peter Thiel, widespread contemporary existential fears abound, whether they are about nuclear war, bioweapons, climate change, artificial intelligence, or fertility collapse, or all of them together. And these, he thinks, are both a possible manifestation of biblical prophecies of the end times, and also a means by which the Antichrist will seize power. We must be vigilant, Thiel argues, against the manipulation of our fears of conflict, including a World War III, to yield to the world government of the Antichrist. Specifically, Thiel asserts that the Antichrist will use fears of Armageddon to create a world government which will not only gain our consent for an unjust peace, but will also hold back technological progress, and keep us in a state of stagnation. And so you see the Antichrist is the Luddite. And we can see glimpses of this world government, Thiel argues, this world government of the Antichrist, in the form of international financial regulation and international criminal law. The first bit of this he worked out while he was at PayPal, where apparently it was natural to think about the Antichrist. And the second he seems to have developed in conversation with an accused war criminal whose military uses Palantir software to target Palestinians. A further key element is that for Thiel, the United States is at the heart of all of this, but in a contradictory fashion. We can see here a quote which gives, I think, a pretty good indication of the level of thinking that's going into Thiel's analysis here, and also the contradictory nature. And here he's just throwing around eschatological concepts he's pulling out from the book of Daniel or the book of Revelations, and mixing it up with various themes we'll touch on shortly. Thiel also won't be drawn specifically on saying exactly who the Antichrist is, but he is quite happy to indulge in speculation on the topic. So it might be Greta Thunberg, but probably not. It might be AOC, which for Thiel is especially worrying because she might be able to create an alliance between Washington and a woke American Pope. It's definitely not Bill Gates, although in these lectures he says that Bill is a very, very awful person. And with some hesitation after it was otherwise put to him by Do That, is not in fact Thiel himself. None of these elements add up to a serious engagement with theology or with the role that eschatology plays within a religious framework, which we might understand perhaps as first to give some meaning to human existence or consolation for suffering or evil on earth. Second, to try to square the apocalyptic or eschatological aspects of the religion with its core teachings. And third, to animate an ethics of one kind or another. All of those things are absent in Thiel's work. Nor, despite Thiel's references to Girard and Schmidt, is there any serious engagement with scholarly traditions of eschatology within political theory. It's what we might call bad eschatology, and its lack of rigour has caused some to suggest that we should ignore it. The authors of a new and sure to be influential book, Muskism, historian Quinn Slobodian and technology writer Ben Tarnoff certainly think so. Slobodian specifically warned that we should, quote, avoid the Thiel distraction. It is misguided, Slobodian suggested, to apply intellectual history methods to a regime of accumulation, a problem he locates as particularly prevalent amongst the French and the Germans. This isn't theology or a new enlightenment, he suggested, and most importantly, these people don't read, so we shouldn't pay too much attention to what they write about what they say they have read. Instead, what they have is a revenue model. It's not serious work, really, and so we shouldn't take it seriously. Now, despite neither being French nor German, I'm very grateful for this provocation because it's prompted me to think about why the lack of quality of Thiel's eschatology is actually a reason for taking it seriously. Now, the possibility that bad eschatology is effective, of course, is not a new insight. It was no answer to the effectiveness of Nazi millennial beliefs that their proponents could not agree, as Alison McQueen points out, on whether in the world to come after cataclysmic war and the defeat of the Jews, Germans would be transformed into divine beings or enjoy worldly immortality through the salvation of the Volk, or exist within a more mundane vision of a reconstructed Germany. Nor did it matter that when the Nazis took the idea of the third status from the apocalyptic writings of 12th century Calabrian monk Joachim of Fiore and transformed them into a vision of the Third Reich, they were not, in fact, being faithful to Joachim's work. So how and why should we pay attention to bad eschatology? Well, a few reasons. When it comes to whipping up existential fears in service of a political and economic project that would exacerbate the material causes of those fears, clarity, rigour, and coherence are not your friend. If Thiel was to be clear about the reasons for the existential fears he mentions, he would have to spend some time looking in the mirror and think about the technological, geopolitical, environmental, and financial arrangements in which he and his firms actively participate. And so, incoherent and underdeveloped apocalyptic language is more likely to be effective than less. It also does Thiel no good to ignore the general atmosphere of catastrophe and pretend that everything is okay. Indeed, as Jeffrey Epstein wrote to Peter Thiel in 2016, celebrating Brexit, quote, finding things on their way to collapse was much easier than finding the next bargain. Collapse is indeed profitable, and an atmosphere of existential conflict, environmental collapse, and racial antagonism is especially good for purveyors of surveillance and military technology. The sense of inevitability and mystery conjured by eschatological thinking is crucial. We know that there will be a transformation, but we don't know precisely when or how it will manifest. This maps on well to the atmosphere of uncertainty and mysteriousness surrounding technology generally and artificial intelligence especially. It is presented as both inevitable and carrying a potential beyond anyone's understanding and control. This idea that we saw before that the Antichrist will hold back science and technology obviously casts the visionary technology founder in opposition to that figure and makes clear which side the rest of us should take if we want to be on the side of the elect. And it also gives an all-encompassing, if not coherent, explanation for economic and technological stagnation. More pointedly, Thiel's explicit linking of the Antichrist with the one-world state, which is the common trope, and his insistence that the Antichrist will use international institutions to assume power is an explicit nod to evangelical Christian eschatology in the US, connecting him to a significant constituency in that country, a decent number of whom are influenced by the Left Behind book series and otherwise, to believe or wonder if the Antichrist will take the form of the Secretary General of the United Nations. A key part of that constituency is dedicated to Christian Zionism, and through it the eschatological visions of the Israeli far right, which devalues Palestinian and Muslim life specifically, but also Jewish and Christian life in explicit service of millennial goals. This extends the devaluation of Muslim life in the war on terror, which Jyoti Raja shows to be a complex and integrated technological, legal, and cultural process. Now, an eschatology which devalues life does not need coherence or rigor to be effective. Does it really matter whether there is a theological or scholarly basis for the claim made by Netanyahu's brother-in-law, apparently himself a biblical scholar, that depopulating Gaza is a messianic task entrusted to his brother-in-law, for which even the Israeli hostages' lives should yield? Or whether there is a biblical foundation, as US Ambassador to Israel Mike Huckabee asserts, which gives Israel rights well beyond its current borders? Or whether the US troop commanders instructing their soldiers that the war in Iran will bring about Armageddon have a sound basis in theology for this view? Or indeed whether Pete Hegseth's celebration of the Crusades and the dangers posed by Islam is historically accurate or well argued. Now, that this constituency is splitting over the war in Iran does not make it any less significant, and it's interesting that this split immediately took the form of speculation, fueled by Tucker Carlson, of all people, about whether Trump might himself be the Antichrist. Now, bad eschatology, which is devoid of any ethical dimension, helps to create a political atmosphere in which human life in general is devalued as insignificant in the grand scheme of things. And we can look to Sam Altman's recent comments about the resources required to bring humans to productive adulthood in order to deflect criticism of AI resource demands as a case in point. Of course, this generalized devaluation does not operate equally, but rather intensifies the danger for certain groups and individuals. Accompanying this devaluation of human life is a devaluation of norms. A more rigorous eschatology would note how Paul's second letter to the Thessalonians and his introduction of the figure of the catechon who would restrain the Antichrist and delay end times was necessary because the community had let their belief in the imminence of end times to abandon any moral constraints on their behavior. Bad eschatology, on the other hand, just allows us to blithely disregard normative constraints as inapt for the end times in which we are living without grappling with the consequences. Thiel's bad eschatology is therefore not a distraction from the destructive environmental, economic, geopolitical, and racial projects championed by Silicon Valley executives and exemplified by Palantir. Instead, I argue, it is an attempt to clothe them in mystery and inevitability, divine purpose, and political cover. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Richard, for that provocative reminder to take the unserious seriously, and also for offering us a new frame to think about it, the frame of bad eschatology. So thank you very much. We're now going to hear from my colleague, Dr. Adil Hassan Khan, who's my colleague here at the Laureate Program in Global Corporations and International Law. Adil's research focuses on the histories of Southern traditions of laws of nations, jurisprudence, and the jurisprudence of encounters amidst European colonization and imperial domination, with a particular interest in revivalist Islamic legal traditions and the role of universities. And Adil will be addressing the topic on the authorization and subversion of cultish corporations towards a jurisprudence of end times. Over to you, Adil.
Thank you so much, Andre. The biblical historian Daniel foresaw an increase in knowledge towards the end of time. As knowledge increased, apocalyptical fears would mount, leaving room for a tyrant to rise. In late modernity, such worries are unfashionable and the Antichrist is a forgotten figure. Our universities tell us that fears of the apocalypse are irrational and that the world is simply getting better. These are the opening lines of Peter Thiel's Antichrist lecture series. And while I would like to thank my colleague Richard Joyce and my other fellow panelists for firmly putting this calumny to bed, I want to make note of this constant anxiety in Thiel and his fellow Silicon Valley end-time prophets that they must be and are not taken seriously as intellectuals and dark prophets, which perhaps has somewhat contributed to the reaction on the part of some intellectuals, such as the aforementioned Quinn Slobodian, to suggest that we don't need to take seriously and thus examine what they say and only be concerned with what they do. Following Richard's lead, I want to argue that neither alternative is particularly productive. There is no doubt these are not serious people, but at the same time, we do live in a world scarred by actions authorized by the force of their musings. After all, one of the key characteristics of the project of colonial modernity is a lack of seriousness with regard to the word, whereby the practice of words becomes instrumental and as demanding no spiritual capacitation on the part of the speaker, while exerting tremendous world-making constitutive force. What they do lack instead is a capacity to form life in a mode that holds these forms with care. Its forms of life are in constant churn and melt. I argue that Thiel's eschatology attempts a political, theological, and I take the phrase, a reactionary futurist deployment of end times that Thiel seeks to mimetically appropriate from religious Zionist eschatology. Thus, theological knowledge instrumentalized for achieving political ends that a serious theologian has recently described as, quote, apocalypse as strategy. I propose to read these lectures alongside Thiel and other relevant Silicon Valley tech lords' musings on end times from within a critical political theology tradition, one which I believe benefits from engaging with this material, especially as it suggests a need for updating the assumed eschatological framework. Critical scholars of political theology have hitherto treated as its object of critique. Now, I argue that Thiel's turn to eschatology seeks to harness the perceived doxic force of end times. This appears to be borne out in part by the fact that 39% of adults surveyed in the US by the Pew Research Center back in 2022 believe that we are currently living through the end times. I further argue Thiel is attempting to instrumentally hang on to the coattails of religious Zionists whose own projects have been at work in these terrains, preparing their congregations for well over a century now. When it comes to the eschatological practice of religious Zionists and Thiel's own eschatology, of particular significance is the strong accelerationist theological doctrine underpinning religious Zionism, one that posits the seemingly paradoxical religious duty of forcing God's hand to hasten the end times. It is this strong Promethean assumption that essentially distinguishes this late modern American and Israeli religious Zionist obsession with end times from that of the Reformation era Christianity, whose history, and I quote, until well into the 16th century, as Koselleck noted, is a history of expectations, or more exactly, the constant anticipation of the end of the world on the one hand, and the continual deferment of the end on the other. Rather, it has in common with colonial modernity's progressive temporality a characteristic, particular form of acceleration, wherein the acceleration of time is a human task. Notably, this is a form of political theology where the emphasis is on the political introduced into theological practice rather than the theological introduced into political practice, thus reversing Schmidt. Thus, religious Zionist eschatology is part of modernity's constellation, sharing modernity's veneration of the cult of man. Except that this messianic Promethean cult is now organized around an ever more restricted figure. That is, moving the propertied white Christian men or even the nation of Israel to now being identified with a singular authoritarian leader figure. For example, Netanyahu being proclaimed as a Josephine Messiah, or Trump's proclamation as God's chosen vessel. One who not only has a duty to, but the capacity to force God's hand. This Zionist accelerationist Prometheus has been on full display in the ongoing war in Iran, on Iran. From the command unit commanders informing US Army officers that President Donald Trump was anointed by Jesus to light the signal fire in Iran to cause Armageddon and mark his return to earth. So what is Peter Thiel trying to get out of mimetically appropriating Messianic Zionist eschatology with a focus on the politics of corporate form? First, I argue that Thiel in these lectures has sought to appropriate the aura of this cult figure of the Promethean preparatory Messiah by combining this figure with its theologically polar opposite figure of the catacon. Thiel is seeking to authorize the tech founder, whose antinomian mythos he has long cultivated, as the one who manages the end times by both hastening Armageddon and keeping at bay the Antichrist. Following Melinda Cooper, I identify this appropriation as seeking to further buttress Thiel's project to further extend the authority of the founder owners of large tech corporations, not only within their own founder-owned firms, but beyond, especially including around the authority to decide the terms of AI and other technology usage and regulation. The prophesizing, prefiguring the onset of end times and claiming to have the power to stage direct its main character is now sought to be made part of the tech founder's Promethean myth. Also at work here, I would like to argue, alongside the promotion and construction of a patrimonial founder-controlled firm by Thiel for more than 1.5 decades now, as Cooper shows in her work, is an attempt to wield this distinct eschatological framework, one which is distinct from the scholastic eschatological framework that has guaranteed and structured order for the past 5 centuries within the project of colonial modernity, through, as Ernst Kantorowicz informed us in his political theology masterpiece, The King's Two Bodies, the corporation as the technology to render the continuous earthly institutions by ascribing and transferring to them a capacity for endurance in time, analogous to angels who are neither eternal nor mortal, referred to as semi-paternity. With this distinct eschatology, it is the figure of the founder that to which the attribute of semi-paternity, analogous to that of an angel, is sought to be transferred. This, I would argue, is not disconnected from the enormous investments made by Thiel and other tech lords in technologies aimed at radical life extension, attempts to cure and push past the limits of the natural body of the corporate sovereign of any more earthly mortal corruption, which might also explain the utter lack of mournfulness amidst all the global chaos and catastrophes that they have themselves been central to engendering. Relatedly, perhaps, is the complete absence of any consolation offered by Thiel's eschatology to the rest of humanity, including those within the religious Zionist fold or ordinary shareholders that it seeks to address. Rapture is promised only to the Silicon Valley elect in the form of their secular arcs, as Naomi Klein and Astra Taylor note in The Rise of the End Times Fascism. To gloss Walter Benjamin, at the end of the neoliberal era, capitalism as a purely cultic religion appears to have found its specific dogma and theology in Thiel's eschatology, an eschatology that further intensifies the dread of inescapable annihilation while offering absolutely no consolation. The other related aim of this appropriation pertains to Thiel's project to refashion the corporate purpose of the large founder-owned tech corporations, and consequently how they might be authorized to conduct themselves in the world. Here, the end times figure with whom the mimetic association is sought is that of the State of Israel itself, which, especially in the wake of almost 3-year-long genocidal spree with international legal impunity, that is increasingly grounded in its chosen status in the end times eschatology, is constructed as an exemplar for a form of tech corporation that also seeks the same impunity and lack of public regulation while conducting its public business, not in the name of generating profits for its shareholders, but preparing for and initiating civilizational wars, and thus securing the white Western civilization itself. It has included extolling of the virtues of conducting ethnic cleansing and autonomous administration, as come across in Balaji Srinivasan's blueprint for what he calls tech Zionism in his book, The Network State. And here I would argue we find the other part of the transformed two bodies of the king, whereby it is the corporate body from which semi-paternity has been transferred to the angel founder that is no longer the old technology of continuity, but is in fact now sought to be operated as a technology to bring about the end of time itself. I would hate to leave you all without consolation. So in the part of the paper I leave out on account of lack of time, I continue the conversation with Benjamin and explore the potential revolutionary resources in the practices of eschatology in the sermons of the Palestinian American Sheikh Omar Soleiman, wherein eschatology is restored to being a part of the arts of consolation, one that attends to the paralyzing temporal anxieties without resorting to Promethean fantasies or political quietism, cultivating a capacity for proactive reliance or tawakkul. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Adil, not least for, I think, giving us the best riff on Kentaro Horowitz's The King's Two Bodies and the Founder's Two Bodies is brilliant. Thank you. So to bring us closer to the end, to push us to the end, we now have Professor James Martell. He's a professor in the Department of Political Science at San Francisco State University. He's published widely on anarchist theory and political theology. His most recent book is Anarchist Prophets, Disappointing Vision and the Power of Collective Sight. And Professor Martell will be speaking on rationalism, Roko's basilisk, and the end of times, apocalyptic and post-Earth futurism in Silicon Valley. With you, James.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. It's exciting to be with all of you. I just want to say two preliminary things. First, the issues I'm going to be talking about might seem like pretexts, but I think, as everyone else has been saying, you have to take these pretexts seriously because, after all, liberalism was created as a kind of a pretext for capitalism and has taken on so many, like a life of its own in a way. So I think we have to take these very seriously. Secondly, it's going to seem like I'm saying something very almost the opposite of the last two speakers, but I don't think it is. I think that speaks both to the incoherent nature of all of this and also to the fact that I think all this talk of the end of the world has motivated a bunch of Silicon Valley billionaires to try to get beyond the world entirely. So I'm speaking to you from the belly of the beast, literally. I'm in Berkeley, California, in the vicinity of San Francisco, which has itself been devoured and occupied by Silicon Valley many years ago. And I've watched over the years as Silicon startups went from having goofy names like Yahoo and Google and slogans like "Don't be evil" through a process of moving from liberalism to libertarianism and now to fascism. Like many others, I initially bought the stance of harmless and casual business practices that were endemic to Silicon Valley. Unlike in New York, where you have to wear business attire, in Silicon Valley, you could wear shorts and sandals to work. You could smoke pot. You could be weird and countercultural. But as we all know by now, this was all just a kind of chrysalis to disguise a much uglier and more violent form of capitalism, one that I think has serious and mostly very bad implications for the rest of us. What I want to focus on here is how a few doctrines have become very widespread among the tech billionaires in challenging some of the fundamentals of how Western thought has been structured. My argument will be that having essentially used up and dominated the entire world, the acme of Western capitalism, which is centered in Silicon Valley, is looking beyond the stricture of space and time that have up to now contained it and looking for ever greater forms of dominance. In other words, trying to move even beyond eschatology. In this regard, I want to talk about a couple of philosophical movements within the body of the tech world. One is called effective altruism, and the other is called rationalism. Both of these views, but especially rationalism, seek to reach beyond the limits of what even the most ardent capitalists once dreamed of. They have, in effect, pierced the veil of teleology, a way of conceiving time that dates back to ancient Greece and which has placed some kind of cosmic limit on the ideas of growth and expansion. Even as tech is revolutionizing capitalism, it is also, in effect, revolutionizing philosophy and the very sense of reality that we collectively inhabit. So let me start with the lesser of the two systems in terms of the threat that it poses to the human race. Effective altruism was a movement that started in the early 2000s, and it has both an institutional presence in groups like the so-called evidence-based charity GiveWell, as well as Giving What We Can, and is also connected to think tanks like the Singularity Institute, which has now changed its name to MIRI, the Machine Intelligence Research Institute, and the Future of Humanity Institute, which are more formally part of the rationalist movement. The idea of effective altruism is that very rich people are the best source of altruism because they have proven themselves in the market to be the most disciplined and capable. This serves not only to justify their wealth, but also to make a case for why they should have a large amount of power and clout as well, given their exalted status. The effective altruism movement has one very important principle, which they call impartiality. This is influenced by the philosopher Peter Singer, who argues that one should not necessarily favor people who are nearer or more familiar to you over people who are far away. This sounds good, maybe, but it leads to a lot of horrible conclusions. Infamously, the effective altruist philosopher William McCaskill, when asked in a public forum in 2015 if he would choose between saving a child from a burning building or saving a Picasso painting and donating it to charity, he said he'd save the painting. He's since been forced to revise his position a bit to allow for saving children at least some of the time due to the massive backlash he received for saying that. The point of this is that effective altruism allows tech billionaires to assuage any guilt they might feel as they begin to accumulate a degree of riches that were literally unimaginable only a generation before. The competition is now on to see who will be the world's first trillionaire. This helps to explain how San Francisco has one of the most wretched and visible homeless populations in the world, even as it has forms of wealth that are unprecedented in human history. The effective altruist doesn't have to worry about what's in front of them. They can think about the people as a whole and use their wealth any way they want. And this leads to rationalism, the far more dangerous philosophy, which is, however, very much connected to and even coming out of the effective altruist movement. Rationalism, or more accurately, the rationalist community, to distinguish this from the older mainstream liberal philosophical system, was formed initially in two internet blogs, especially one called Less Wrong and another one called Astral Codex 10. Rationalism was also developed at a private club called Lighthaven, which is actually about a half a mile from where I'm speaking. One of the founders of Less Wrong, Eliezer Yudkowsky, is one of the main proponents of the movement. Another name for this group is hyper-utilitarianism. The main goals of the movement are the avoidance of all cognitive bias. That's something that also stems from the effective altruist movement. Transhumanism, and also the colonization and domination of the rest of the universe. Some refer to the whole movement as TESCREAL, which stands for transhumanism, extropianism, I had to look that one up, singularianism, cosmism, rationalism, effective altruism, and long-termism. Building on the ideas of Jeremy Bentham's utilitarianism and really bringing out the monstrous features inherent in that philosophy as well, the rationalist community argues that the number one priority of the human race should be to get off this planet. Taking a very long-term, i.e. long-termist view, the rationalists argue that given that the sun will eventually supernova in about 5 billion years and destroy the Earth, it is imperative to get off this planet and colonize other worlds, beginning with Mars. But Mars, of course, will only be a way station since it too will be devoured by the supernova. Should this happen, should they get off the planet, they reason, the natural strictures on the human race will be eliminated and there will be literally no cap on the number, the wealth, and the power of the human race, albeit this race will be completely different from us given all the bioengineering and other forms of adaptation to new environments that will be required. Given this, they further argue anything that is done in the short term, even if it's very harmful to many people on this planet, is justified by the good that it would produce for the untold future number of humans in outer space. These other humans would hugely outnumber the number of currently living people, and so justify just about anything that needs to be done here and now, all according to this very basic utilitarian calculus. And you can see why Elon Musk loves this system. It justifies basically everything that he does. There's even a kind of a fringe religious cult that comes from this movement. Rocco's basilisk is a hypothesis that the singularity, which is the moment when AI becomes fully self-conscious and thus achieves the status of a god, may have already occurred. And it may be that we're already in a simulacrum run by the singularity, and we're all being tested as to whether we advance or repress the creation of this new god, and we will be rewarded or punished accordingly. Although all this sounds totally abstract and crazy, it has already led to real violence. A terrorist group of sorts called the Zizians formed to stop the singularity from happening and actually murdered a few people, although no one who was actually connected to the AI industry. And actually, they're all now in jail. So there are real effects no matter how crazy this is. The upshot of all of this is that these philosophical movements are not merely a way to justify the crass self-interest of billionaires like Musk. These movements pose a serious danger to the entire planet. Issues like global warming are irrelevant if we're going to leave the planet behind anyway. I heard one guy saying that it was because animals are suffering in the current world, it'd be better just to get rid of them all and replace them with virtual animals who will never suffer. That's the kind of thinking that we're talking about. Furthermore, the suffering of millions of humans is similarly nothing compared to the well-being of future generations of superhumans that will be bioengineered beyond the limits of our bodies. Billionaires are already financing ways to avoid aging and even dying, and cryogenics is a growing field as well. In short, what we are witnessing is the first generation of human beings who have sought to materially alter the built-in limitations of being a human being in the first place. What previous generations sought to do through magic, alchemy, or religion, the current generation of tech billionaires and their hangers-on want to solve death, the limitation of being on one planet, the inconvenience of other people and their needs, as well as the more general desire for absolute power within their own lifetime, which hopefully will be stretched to an inordinate length. I've personally never been a fan of Western teleology and the idea of progress. To me, it always smacked of colonialism and a self-referential form of white supremacy. But even this may look quaint and amateurish when compared to the attempt to break beyond the barriers of time and space and human mortality that currently serve as real and material limits to the human race. I've always thought of neoliberalism as a kind of death cult, and the irony may be that this cult is being realized now through the work of those whose stated purpose is to end death itself. As Sigmund Freud explained, the drives for pleasure and death turn out to be one and the same, and we can see that being evidenced in the deeply dangerous confluence between rationalism, the drive to make an AI singularity a reality, and the money and wealth that are being produced in Silicon Valley. In my view, these people are the enemy of the human race, precisely because they have sought to abandon what it means to be human in the first place. Having achieved a kind of ultimate financial and political power, they have hit upon a real limit in what otherwise seemed to be an otherwise limitless horizon in terms of the accumulation of wealth and power. The limit is not just their own mortality and the problems of the effects of 300 years of capitalism on our environment. It is other people, people who might organize and dare to push back on their grab for absolute power. The rest of us, in other words, are their problem, and it is incumbent on us to do everything in our power to stop the destruction of the human race as we know it. Our species has a pretty bad track record, but I would still throw my lot in with it rather than with whatever monstrous beings arise in our wake. I also see one bit of good news in all of this. The degree to which these groups have defied all prior limits also means that they're exposing themselves beyond the protections of liberal ideology, which has long gaslighted people to be okay with the rich and the powerful. In light of these new horrible philosophies leading to yet more horrible behavior, this may be an opportunity for the left to reassert its role as being pro-human in the most mundane and ordinary sense of that word. I guess we'd be the Antichrist, according to Peter Thiel. When humanity as such is being discarded by capitalism, it may be a chance, but only that, for the left to reassert itself against this ultimate threat. And maybe we might be able to recenter ourselves precisely via the limitations of being human, to accepting and even cherishing our mortality, our vulnerability, but also our collective resilience and creativity that comes only because and not despite of what limits us. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, James, for that rather chilling introduction to some of the ways in which these communities are trying to escape and do away with what they might think of as human limitations and what we might think of as simply being human. So, in the, I guess, with the sort of 5 minutes that remain, if there's no other questions that come through the Q&A, perhaps to pick up on James's final point about a kind of left response. And so James has offered us one, I guess, one potential avenue. And I thought we'd perhaps if each of the panelists wanted to perhaps reflect on responses to in the sort of different phenomena that you have each presented us.
Yeah, well, maybe just a general thought. It strikes me because I've been looking at the way Schumpeter was held up in the 1990s new economy boom to to his kind of like ghostly presence today. What strikes me is that the difference between the dot-com and new economy boom and euphoria and today is that there really is no effort to make this palatable. There's no propaganda that goes with it that might sell it to a broader public, and I think that's interesting. And I'll just leave it there. I mean, in terms of practical things to do, I think we got a sense of just how effective, say, a taxation on unrealized capital gains and kind of minimal anti-monopoly laws would have been when we saw their backlash against what Biden and Kamala Harris were trying to do. So, yeah, I'll just leave it there. And I think, the anti-war movement and the backlash against data centers is very promising in many ways.
Thank you, Melinda. Richard.
Thanks, and thanks. Well, I don't know if I have anything to offer in terms of strategy, but I think there's one of the things that my paper was, I guess, gesturing towards is an inability, both really from the center and from the left, to engage with these crazy ideas. In our opposition to Palantir, which I guess has been most recently prompted by that 22-point manifesto that summarizes Paul Karp's The Technological Republic and sort of these fears of explicit fascism being adopted by the corporation. We're able to engage with that kind of language, but we're not really able to engage with these other eschatological things, which I think are crucial to being able to formulate a response and actually to realize just how, picking up on James's paper, just how extreme the ideas are that these extremely powerful people are holding.
Thank you, Richard. Ada, we have a question, perhaps is one that might speak to you. She's asked if anyone wants to pick up on the idea of the Armageddon perpetuating or sustaining from places beyond Silicon Valley, or ways in which the Silicon Valley has moved beyond the US.
Yeah, no, I think that's and you can see that with I guess the musings on the Armageddon in India and what have you, and also, of course, it's the movement of evangelical Zionism outside the US as well, including in Australia and Uganda and what have you. So yeah, I think that's but that's something that I have this much of this stuff that I've looked at, but that's worth, I think, considering of the moving of Silicon Valley outside the US. And in response to, I guess, that initial propagation, I think that it is to take seriously for me, and this is what I find very instructive in the last sort of thinker I ended with, and the pro-Palestine sort of movement more broadly and its organizing, and is this taking seriously the spiritual work that needs to be done in attending to a very paralyzing anxiety that grips us, an anxiety about what's the point of it all, why go on? And I think that's a site which I find productive to consider. And perhaps moving on from a critical political theological investment in attending to melancholia to attending to a different form of temporal anxiety that perhaps is our anxiety of our present, might be worth bearing in mind. Thank you.
Thanks, Ada. And so just a final word, if you have one, James.
Yeah, well, I think what Melinda said is very important. I think the fact that these systems have absolutely no attempt to even bother to placate anybody else, they're completely directed towards themselves, is actually good news for the left, because liberalism has been so good for so long at kind of, as I was saying, gaslighting everybody, and neoliberalism has been slightly worse at that. So it's kind of losing that. And that's a very important way of how power maintains itself, because I think once all you have is violence and kind of raw power, it's actually a much more unstable system. So I'm not an accelerationist by any means, but I think we are accelerating, and I think one of the benefits of that, if you can use that word, is precisely that they really don't even care about what any of the rest of us think, and that's something that we can work on.
Thank you, James, and thank you, everyone. Please, and thank you, everyone, for joining us online today. I think this has been a really wonderful and important intervention, and I understand it's only the beginning of some further work and thinking on this question of the end times and big tech. So please join me in thanking our panelists in whatever way our tech overlords allow us to. So,
And thank you, Andre.
Yes, thank you.
thanks, everyone.
Andre.